Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to be discussing the top 10 non-horror books written by Stephen King. And obviously Stephen King is known as the master of horror, and he has a lot of horror classics. But a lot of his books just simply don't have horror elements, or they have little to no horror elements. And for these books that I'm going to be including in my top 10, almost no horror elements. And, there are some books that he has that border, like, is this a thriller with horror elements or what have you? But honestly, this is one of the main reasons why Stephen King has always been one of my favorite authors, is he's able to tell such different stories and blend different genres in seamlessly. And yeah, but for today's video, I'm going to be discussing some of my favorites that are not horror. And I want to preference, these are my favorites. There are definitely going to be some omissions on this list that might bug some people, but this is my list. If you want to go make your list, you go do it. But this is my top 10, and you know what? Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And I'm just going to first start out with a quick honorable mention and just mention the entire Dark Tower series. This is obviously a fantasy series. It's Stephen King's magnum opus. There are horror elements within all of these books, but overall this is just such an entity on its own. It's such a mishmash of all different types of genres. I wanted to include it, just, Stephen King writing fantasy, not horror, but it's 8 books, so I didn't know to choose one over the other, so I'm just going to quickly mention it here. Also, just another disclaimer, this top 10 is not ranked. In fact, I'm just going to be doing this in pub order. So to start off with, we're going to actually start off with my all-time favorite Stephen King book, which of course is The Dead Zone. Now, this could kind of be argued as a horror book, but for my mind, it's a thriller with some sci-fi elements. And if you don't know what the book is about, it's about this guy named Johnny Smith who has this horrible accident, and he gets into a coma, and he wakes up years later, and when he touches people, he's able to see into their future. And obviously the story kind of expands from that. And yeah, I wouldn't really say this book is scary at all. I mean, it has some tense moments, obviously, but for me, it's definitely more of a thriller. And, like I said, it's my favorite, so I had to include it on the list here. This next book is 100% not a horror book, and it's often cited as his worst book. But for my money, it's one of his best, and it is Roadwork. And this is one of the Richard Bachman books, and this is basically just a character examination. And if you don't like that, you will not like this book. But for me, this book was excellent. We follow this guy named Barton Dawes, who is very bitter and angry that his business is basically going to be taken over by this highway company. They're going to steamroll over it, and it's basically just 300 pages of him trying to deal with that. It's very good. A lot of people hate this book, but for my money, it's one of Stephen King's best and most underrated. Next up on the list, we have Different Seasons, which is my second or third favorite Stephen King book. It's his first novella collection, and if you don't know, this has such stories as Shawshank Redemption, which is clearly not horror, very excellent. And Stephen King has a famous story of this woman walking up to him in a grocery store, and she's like, "Oh, you write all those ugly, terrible books. I like uplifting stories like that Shawshank Redemption." And then, obviously, she doesn't realize that he wrote that too. But yeah, Shawshank Redemption, you got The Body, which is Stand By Me, also not horror. And then you've got Apt Pupil, which I guess you could kind of say is horror, but not really. And then you got The Body, which, same thing. But overall, this is definitely not a typical Stephen King horror book. I would not call it a horror book. And it's, one of my favorites. And I've always said that Stephen King is at his best writing novellas, and this is top tier Stephen King right here. This next book is 100% not a horror book, and that's because it's essentially a YA fantasy book, kind of, before that was a thing. We got The Eyes of the Dragon, which is actually a standalone fantasy book and kind of written in the tone of what we would call young adult today. He wrote this essentially for Naomi, his daughter. And yeah, it's basically just like a typical classic fantasy with some Stephen King mannerisms sprinkled out, but definitely not a horror book. And this one's actually pretty good. I've read it 2 or 3 times, still holds up. Pretty interesting take on the fantasy genre. And yeah, I really like it. This next book I would categorize more as a psychological thriller, and that would be Dolores Clayborn, which is a newer addition to my top 10 list, which I'll link down below. I think when I first read it, I didn't appreciate it as much. The second time around, I listened to the audiobook, which blew my mind, and now it shot up into my top 10. It's essentially about this woman named Dolores Clayborn, and she's recounting her life. And yeah, there are like some minor horror elements, like there's some tense moments, but overall, it's just, you're getting her narration of her life and the craziness that surrounds it, and it's very good. The next book is another book, kind of like The Shawshank Redemption, where people are very surprised to find out that it is, in fact, a Stephen King book and movie, and that would be The Green Mile. There's so many people, like, I'll just say, like, oh yeah, The Green Mile by Stephen King, and they're very shocked. But it just goes to show you that Stephen King, very diverse writer, he can write more than horror. Definitely not a horror book, and if you don't know, this is essentially about a prison, and you're following characters from it. It's in the 1930s. There's a lot of racial stuff going on, and some magical realism stuff going on, but not really a lot of horror elements to it. It's very good, timeless, it's a classic. Next up on the list is another fan least favorite. A lot of people really do not like this book, but it's always been one of my favorites. And that would be The Colorado Kid by Stephen King, of course. This one basically is just like a murder mystery where you don't really figure out what it is by the end. A lot of people hate it for that reason, and there's not really a lot of horror elements because it's basically just crime fiction. People sitting around talking about an old crime that happened years ago. They're trying to figure out the ins and outs of it, but ultimately there's no reveal, which people hate, but I really like. And yeah, not really a lot of horror going around in this book. Next up, we have yet another Richard Bachman book, which I think people are kind of mixed on, which I don't understand because I think this novel is brilliant, and that would be Blaze. And this one was more of like a truck novel. He wrote this in the 70s, kind of like his take of Mice and Men. He didn't really think it was that great, but then in 2007 or 8, I think, he kind of he went back, rewrote a bit, and then re-released it. And I think it's very good. And it's a bit supernatural because it's his take of Mice and Men, but there's a ghost involved. It's pretty good, but I would definitely not say it's a horror book, more of like a psychological thriller. Next book we have up is definitely more of like a mystery thriller book with not really any supernatural stuff going on, and definitely no horror elements. And that would be Finders Keepers, which is the second book in the Bill Hodges trilogy. And it's easily my favorite of the trilogy. Mr. Mercedes, the first book, is decent, and then End of Watch, I really don't think is that good. But Finders Keepers is definitely excellent. And it has a very interesting start because like the first 120 pages, Bill Hodges and the gang isn't even introduced yet. And we just get this very interesting narrative. And I don't want to give too much away, but like it's very good. If you have not read it, you obviously got to read Mr. Mercedes first, but just get to the second book. It's excellent. Last up on my list is one of Stephen King's newer released novels, which is Billy Summers, which I would definitely not say is a horror book, or I would definitely say it's not a horror book. There, I can talk. But yeah, it's definitely like a thriller. It's basically, this character, Billy Summers, he's an assassin. It's kind of like his last job kind of trope where like, I'm going to do one more and then that's it. And then obviously it's Stephen King, so shit goes crazy, but it's very good. And it's kind of one of those books where like halfway through, the story kind of changes. Some people don't like that kind of storytelling. Like that happens in The Dead Zone, which obviously is my favorite. And a lot of people have mixed opinions on that as well, but for me, the turn that it takes is very good, and it's definitely one that I can see myself rereading in the future. All right, so that is my top 10 non-horror books written by Stephen King. What do you guys think of my list? Obviously, there are some horrendous omissions, and obviously this is my personal favorites list. So I know everybody in the comments is probably going to say, where's 11/22/63? That's Stephen King's best book, and it's non-horror. I think it's overrated. And there goes the subscribers going away. But yeah. Not one of my favorites. I will admit it's a good book. Just it's never been one of my favorites. But it is a clear example of Stephen King writing non-horror with a bit of sci-fi elements. And then there's some other examples, I'm sure. Maybe like From a Buick H, I wouldn't really say is a horror book. That's never been one of my favorites. The Running Man is more of like a dystopian sci-fi book, but that's never been one of my favorites. Same thing with The Long Walk. That used to be one of my favorites, but after a reread, it kind of fell off. Not one of my favorites anymore. Lacey's Story, no. But yeah, you get the idea. Stephen King definitely... you know what? I won't even say that. I was going to say Stephen King is at his best writing horror, but clearly, you know, some of my all-time favorites, like The Dead Zone, Different Seasons, Green Mile, not horror. And like I said, one of my favorite authors because he's able to blend genres seamlessly and write a multitude of different stories. But like I said, what do you guys think of my list? Do you agree with me or do you completely disagree with me? Either way, I want you to comment down below and tell me how wrong I am. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Continue to subscribe, and if you're not subscribed, go do so. And we also have the Bookish Drummer Discord, where we always have a lot of fun things going on, including the Stephen King Short Story Book Club, and we'll be starting the Bazaar of Bad Dreams January 8th, which will conclude in May, just in time for the release of Stephen King's newest short story collection, You Like It Darker, which we will be reading. And yeah, a lot of cool Stephen King stuff going on. And hopefully I can get back to regular filming and be able to talk normally. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.